The morning they sold off the Kestrel yard, the fog came in off the reach so thick that the crane at the end of the pier looked like a pencil sketch somebody had started and given up on. Half of Blanchard's Landing turned out anyway. There was coffee in a cardboard urn on the tailgate of a truck. There were folding chairs set in crooked rows on the gravel. And there was a hand-lettered sale bill stapled to the gate listing everything the Kestrel Salvage Company had owned for the better part of a century. People had driven up from 3 counties for the crane and the flatbed and the 2 welding rigs. There was a boat trailer everybody wanted and a coil of anchor chain that would end up going for more than the trailer. Nobody had driven anywhere for Lot 41. Lot 41 sat by itself at the far edge of the gravel where the yard ran out into the water, and it had sat in that same spot longer than most of the people standing around it had been alive. It was a diving bell. Bronze, 9 feet tall, shaped like a great blunt egg with a flared skirt at the bottom, crusted over with old barnacle scar and green verdigris until, from any distance at all, you would have taken it for a boulder somebody had dragged up out of the harbor. Iron bands had been strapped around its middle and had rusted into the metal until the bands and the bell were one thing. The top hatch was bolted shut with a ring of square-headed bronze bolts, and around the seam of that hatch somebody had run a bead of lead and tallow and paid it down hard, the way a man seals a thing he does not intend to have opened. It weighed a little over 2 tons. It had stayed shut since the fall of 1961, and in all those years, so far as anybody in that town could tell you, it had never been opened. Alva Kestrel had built the yard out of nothing, and for 40 years his bell had done the pier work up and down that stretch of coast, going down over the side on a chain to let men stand dry on the bottom and set stone. Then, one autumn, he had it hauled up onto the gravel, set on a steel cradle, bolted, sealed, and left. He was asked about it for the rest of his life, and he gave the same answer every time, which was that it was empty, and that it was heavy, and that a man could ask about something else. He died in the spring, and the nephews who took over the yard had no more idea than anybody. They tried to sell it twice for the bronze, and both times the scrap price was not worth the rigging bill. So it stayed where it was, and the barnacle scar went gray, and the town stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing a stump in your own field. There were guesses, naturally. In a harbor town, a guess gets handed down like a kitchen table. The most popular one was concrete, poured in solid so that nobody would ever bother stealing it. And that guess had the great advantage of explaining the weight. The second most popular was harbor water, sealed in to keep the smell down. A retired lobsterman held out for sand until the day he died and would take money on it from anybody. And then, one summer in the 70s, 2 boys got at the skirt with a hand drill and worked most of an afternoon and made it through a 1/4 inch of bronze, and what the bit came back with was wood shavings. That settled it for a generation. The word went around that Alva had packed the thing with dunnage and old timber to keep it from ringing in a gale, and after that nobody wondered about it seriously again. The hole those boys made is still there. Marta Quillen has looked at it 100 times in her life, and it was only much later, standing in her own shop with a light in her hand, that she understood she had been looking at a splinter of the answer since she was a child. Orrin Peck ran the sale, and he worked through the good lots first, the way an auctioneer does, so the crowd would still be warm when he got to the leavings. He got a fine price for the crane. He got a better one for the chain. And then he stood on a milk crate at the edge of the gravel with the fog burning off behind him and said, "All right, Lot 41, the bell, 2 tons of bronze, and let us not pretend, folks, this is scrap weight. Who will start me?" Nobody started him. The arrangement on a yard sale like that is plain enough. Whatever does not sell goes to the scrap contractor at weight. And the scrap contractor for 4 towns in either direction was standing near the front with his arms folded. That was Desmond Roach. He is a marine salvage dealer, and he has been one since he was a young man, and he is the loudest thing in any room he walks into. He waited until Peck asked for a bid a second time, and then he turned around so the whole crowd could hear him, and said that the only man who ever made $1 off that bell was the man who sold Alva the bolts. People laughed. He said a person would need a torch, a week, and a strong reason to lie to their own accountant. People laughed harder. Peck asked a third time, mostly for form, and that is when Marta Quillen put her hand up and said $140. The laughter did not stop. It changed, is all. It went from the kind of laughter a crowd gives a man who is being funny to the kind it gives a woman who has just done something it does not understand. And that second kind is worse, because it has a little pity mixed into it. The gavel came down on the sale so fast that Peck nearly dropped it, and while she was still walking up to pay, Roach called out over the heads of everybody standing there that she had just bought herself a rusted egg. He said it grinning, with his arms wide, playing to the gravel like a man on a stage, and the crowd gave him what he wanted. Somebody asked if it came with a spoon. Marta paid at the card table by the gate, folded her receipt, put it in her shirt pocket, and did not say one word back to any of them. She was 54 years old that autumn, and she had run a one-woman welding shop on the Harbor Road for 19 years, and before that she had worked for other people's shops since she was a girl. She fixed lobster boat rails and davits and the busted trailer frames that come off the winter roads, and she was good, and everybody knew she was good, and none of that had ever made her fashionable. Her father had welded for Alva Kestrel for 22 years. Marta had grown up in that yard. She had eaten lunch in the shadow of that bell more times than she could count, and when she was small she had put her ear against the bronze on hot days because it was cool, and once, when she was 11, she had asked her father what was in it. And her father, who answered every question she ever asked him for the rest of his life, had looked at the water and not answered that one. That is why she bid. Not because she knew. Because a man who tells his daughter everything had one thing he would not tell her, and she had been carrying that around for 43 years. Getting it home was 2 days of work and every favor she had. The crane was sold and already loaded, so she did it the old way, with cribbing timbers and a chainfall and a hand winch anchored to a truck frame, walking the cradle across the gravel an inch at a time. She had Ottilie Soley's grandson bring his flatbed down at low tide, because the yard road floods at the top of the tide and a flatbed with 2 tons on the deck does not argue with water. It could not be lifted by anything smaller than the crane she no longer had, so it was not lifted, it was rolled and dragged and levered, and she hauled it up onto the deck on ramps with the winch clicking one tooth at a time and half the Harbor Road watching from their porches. Twice the cribbing shifted under the skirt, and both times she stopped everything and rebuilt the stack instead of pushing on, which is the difference between people who move heavy things for a living and people who move one heavy thing once. It took her the better part of 4 hours to cover the last 60 feet. When the deck finally took the weight, the truck springs went down and stayed down, and the grandson walked around the tires twice and asked her sincerely whether they were going to make the hill on the Harbor Road. They made the hill at the speed of a man carrying a full bucket, with the flashers going and a line of cars behind them that nobody honked in, and the whole town got a good long look at 2 tons of green bronze going by at walking pace. Roach drove by twice. The second time he slowed down and did not say anything, which she noticed and which she thought about for a long while afterward. She set it in her shop on the same steel cradle, blocked it, and left the doors open. Because a thing that size makes a shop feel like a cave if you shut it in. And then the visit started. Everybody in that town found a reason to need a hinge welded that month. They would stand around it with their hands in their pockets, and they would all say the same 3 words within about a minute of walking in, which were, "Cut it open." She had a plasma cutter 20 feet away. 2 hours of careful work and a bit of patience with the lead bead, and she would have known. Every person who came through that shop told her so, and some of them told her twice. She did not open it. She said no to every one of them, in the same flat way she said no to customers who wanted a repair she thought would fail. When they pushed, she gave them a reason, and it was a better reason than any of them expected. She said that a man she had known her whole life sealed that hatch on purpose with lead and paid it down, and then answered questions about it for the rest of his life without once telling a lie he could be caught in. Whatever was in there, he had meant it to stay in there. And she said the second part more quietly, because it was the part that mattered. She said that if she cut it open alone in her shop and something came out of it, it would be her word about what she had found, in a town that had just laughed at her in a gravel yard in front of everybody. She would not be believed, and she would never be finished being asked. So it would stay sealed, she said, until it could be opened in front of people who could not be argued with. Then Roach called. The first call came 9 days after the sale, and it was friendly in that way men are friendly when they want something. He said he would take the bell off her hands for $200, cash, and haul it himself, and she could keep the receipt as a souvenir. She said no thank you. The second call came in November, and the number was $900. The third call came the week before Christmas, and Desmond Roach offered her $2,200 for 2 tons of green bronze that he had personally told a crowd of 60 people was worth less than the rigging bill to move it. And that was the moment the whole thing turned over in her mind. Because Marta Kean is a welder, and a welder knows the price of scrap bronze the way a baker knows the price of flour. $2,200 was not scrap. $2,200 was a man who knew something, and had known it in that gravel yard, with his arms wide, playing to the crowd. He never stopped in public. That is the part that people in Blanchard's Landing still talk about. All that winter, in the front booth at Doreen's on the Harbor Road, Roach kept it up. He asked her how the egg was setting. He asked whether she had named it. He told the counter, more than once, loud enough for the kitchen, that some people buy a boat and some people buy a hole in the water, and Marta had gone and bought the water. She would sit at the end of the counter with her coffee and her hands around the cup and let him have it, every time, and she never once told anybody about the phone calls. She had decided that the difference between what he said in that booth and what he offered on the telephone was the most valuable thing she owned, and you do not spend a thing like that early. Her one friend at that counter, a boat builder named Rufus Dutton, asked her one morning in January why she took it, why she sat there and let a grown man make a routine out of her in front of the whole Harbor Road twice a week. She thought about it long enough that he started to apologize for asking. And then she said that a man who is telling the truth stops when the joke gets old, and that Desmond had been telling the same joke since October and getting louder with it, and that people do not work that hard to keep a crowd believing something they believe themselves. Rufus Dutton said afterward that it was the only time in 20 years he had heard her say anything about anybody behind their back, and that technically she had not, because Roach was sitting 15 feet away with his elbow on the table, grinning at the both of them. In February, she took a brass brush and a bucket of vinegar and cleaned one patch of the skirt, about the size of a dinner plate, low down on the side that faced the wall. It took her most of a Sunday. Under the barnacle scar, the bronze came up the color of a new penny, and in the middle of that patch was a cast cartouche the size of her hand, a rope worked into a ring, an anchor through the middle of it, and a name. Ephraim Verrill, New Bedford. And under that, cast into the metal and not stamped, a set of numbers she read as a year. She spent 3 evenings at the Harbor Library, and one long Saturday at a university reading room 2 hours down the coast, and what she came out with was this. The Verrill Foundry had cast diving gear for the East Coast wreck trade for a little over 30 years. Closed after a fire. and was remembered mostly by people who study that sort of thing for one reason: Verrill made everything by hand and marked everything he made, and almost none of it survived. Because bronze gets melted. 3 of his bells were known to still exist. 2 were in institutions. The 3rd was listed in the literature as last recorded in Maine. She read that sentence standing up in a reading room with her coat still on. And then she read it again. And then she went and asked a librarian to photocopy the page for her because she did not trust her own eyes on it. On the drive home, she pulled into a gravel turnout above the reach and sat there with the engine off for 20 minutes, and what she thought about was not money. She thought about her father, who had welded for Alva Kestrel for 22 years, and who had answered every question she ever put to him except one. She had always assumed that silence was grief, that something had happened in that yard before she was born, and the bell was the marker for it. It had not occurred to her, in 43 years, that a quiet man might simply have been keeping another quiet man's business, and doing it well, and taking it with him. She did not call the newspaper, and she did not call Roach. She called the Cape Wren Maritime Institute, got a voicemail box, left a careful message, and heard nothing for 11 days. Then a woman called back who had clearly been holding the phone with her shoulder while looking at something, and said, in a very level voice, that she would like to come and see it, and could she come Thursday. Dr. Iris Vandeleur is a conservator, and she has been one for 31 years, and when she walked into that shop, she did not touch the bell for the first 20 minutes. She looked at the cradle. She looked at the iron bands. She got down on the floor with the light and looked at the lead bead around the hatch seam, and she asked, twice, whether Marta was certain the seal had never been broken, and Marta said the town would have told her. Because the town tells you everything. Vandeleur said that in her experience, sealed things are almost always empty and almost always disappointing, and that people should be told that before they get their hopes up. Then she stood there with her hands behind her back looking at that hatch for a good while, and said that she would like to be present when it was opened, and that nobody should touch it until then, and that if Marta had no objection, she would bring a photographer. She also said the other thing, the thing that Marta wrote down that night on the back of the receipt she had folded into her shirt pocket in a gravel yard the previous autumn. Vandeleur said that Ephraim Verrill had shown a full set of gear at an exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, and that the centerpiece of that display had been a presentation helmet, gilded, made to be looked at rather than dived in. The exposition record closed the entry with 3 words: returned to maker. Nobody had seen it since. Marta Quillen had one condition, and she did not bend on it. The bell would be opened in her shop. On a Saturday morning, in front of witnesses she invited herself. Vandeleur, who had been to a great many openings and had watched a great many of them turn into arguments, said that was the most sensible thing she had heard all year. So it was staged, and staged is the right word. Marta borrowed chairs from the fire hall, 12 folding chairs, and set 8 of them in 2 rows facing the bell with the shop doors run all the way up. Because it was April and the light came off the water in the morning and filled that whole building. She put a pot of coffee on the bench. She invited Orrin Peck, who had held the gavel. She invited Ottilie Soley, who was 81 and had worked the yard office for Alva Kestrel for 2 decades. She invited her father's oldest friend and a boat builder from the town landing and Peck's wife, and the woman from the harbor library who had pulled the foundry material for her, and the grandson with the flatbed. That was 7. The 8th invitation she wrote out by hand and drove across town and put in the mailbox of Desmond Roach. He came. Of course he came. He came 15 minutes early in the red windbreaker he wears in all weather, and he stood at the back with his arms folded instead of taking a chair, and he told the room that he had come to watch a woman find out what 2 tons of nothing looks like on the inside. A couple of people laughed, out of habit, the way you do. Marta poured him a coffee and handed it to him and said she was glad he could make it. And that was all she said to him the entire morning. The opening took 4 hours, and it was the least dramatic thing anybody in those chairs had ever sat through. Which is how you know it was done right. Vandeleur photographed every surface first. She scored and lifted the lead bead in sections and bagged each section separately with a label. Then she went at the bolts, and there were 14 of them, and every one of them had been in that hatch since the fall of 1961. Marta ran the heat when heat was called for, and backed each bolt out a quarter turn at a time with a bar, and when the 11th one sheared. The whole room made a sound, and Vandeleur said, quite calmly, that this was normal and that they would drill it, and drilled it, and it took 40 minutes. 4 hours is a long time to sit on a folding chair in a welding shop. People got up and stretched and went out to the gravel and came back in. Audley Soley told the 2 rows about the yard office in the old days, about Alva doing his books in pencil, and the smell of the coal stove, and the way he would not let anybody, ever, tie anything off to that cradle. The library woman took notes. Orrin Peck held the tray of bagged lead sections, because Vandeleur handed it to him, and he did not know how to refuse. Nobody left. And at the back of the shop, in the red windbreaker, with his arms folded and his coffee going cold in his hand, Desmond Roach watched every single bolt come out and did not make one joke for 4 hours. And by the 3rd hour there were people in those chairs turning around to look at him instead of at the bell. When the last bolt came out, nothing happened. The hatch had been sitting on tallow and lead and its own weight for 6 decades, and it did not want to move. They got a chain fall over it and lifted it straight up, an inch, and the smell came out first. Not bad. Not the harbor smell everybody expected. Tallow and linen and cold metal, the smell of a closed cupboard in a cold house, and Audley Soley said, out loud, into a completely silent shop, "Oh, Alva, you old devil." Inside the bell, packed upright and braced with cut timber so that nothing could shift. Wrapped first in tallow-soaked linen, and then in oiled canvas, standing in the dry with not one speck of rust on any of it, was the entire hand-made inventory of the Verrill foundry that Alva Kestrel had bought at a fire sale in his 20s, and never told one living person he owned. 6 bronze diving helmets, closed dress, every one of them hand-raised, every one of them carrying the rope and anchor cartouche and a maker's number. A set of 41 wooden foundry patterns, the carved masters that the castings were pulled from, oiled and stacked in racks that had been built to fit that curved interior and nothing else. A rack of hand tools with Verrill's mark on the tangs, and at the center, braced on its own timber stand, wrapped in 3 layers and tied with tarred line, the presentation helmet from the Philadelphia Exposition, gilded, with the rope and anchor worked into the crown in relief and the gilt as bright as the day it left the bench. Dr. Vandeleur sat down on one of the folding chairs. That is the detail Marta tells people about. A woman who had been doing this work for 31 years put her hand out for the back of a fire hall chair and sat down in it. She gave the room her verdict that same morning, on the record, with the photographer running, and she was careful to say twice that these were working figures for insurance purposes and that a formal appraisal would follow in writing. The bell itself, she said, a documented Verrill, the 3rd known and the only one still in private hands, she would insure at $115,000. The 6 helmets, complete and marked and unrestored, $96,000 taken together. The pattern set, which she said was frankly the rarest thing in the building because patterns are firewood to everybody except the one person who understands them, $61,000. And the exposition helmet, authenticated by its own record, unseen since 1876, she would insure at $190,000 by itself. $462,000, she said, and asked if anybody needed her to repeat it. Nobody in those 2 rows of folding chairs moved. Orenpeck took his cap off. Audley Soley was crying and not bothering about it, and at the back of the shop, Desmond Roach stood there holding a paper cup of coffee he had not drunk in 4 hours, with his mouth open, and said nothing at all. He was white as the primer on the wall behind him. He did not look at the bell, and he did not look at the helmets. He stared at Martha Quillen, and she let him, and she did not smile, and the shop stayed quiet for long enough that everybody in it understood exactly what they were watching. He tried, once, he said, into that silence, that he had always figured there was something in it. And the woman from the Harbor Library, who is soft-spoken and about 5 feet tall, said without any particular heat, "Then why did you tell the whole yard it was scrap?" Roach did not answer her. He put the coffee cup down on the bench, and he walked out to his truck, and Orenpeck said afterward that the sale made sense to him now for the first time. Because if Lot 41 had gone unsold, it would have gone to the scrap contractor at Waite, and the scrap contractor had stood at the front of that crowd making sure nobody bid. He had made his own offers to the nephews twice, it came out later, for the bronze, at Waite, and been turned down both times because Alva Kestrel had told his family the bell was not to be cut. Roach had known about the cartouche for years. He had cleaned that same patch himself with a rag one afternoon when the yard was empty, and he had put the rag in his pocket and said nothing to anybody, and then he had stood in a gravel yard and made 60 people laugh at a woman for $140. The Institute bought the exposition helmet and a pattern set from her that summer for $251,000, and they are on public display now in a case with Alva Kestrel's name on the label and her father's underneath it, because she asked for that and would not be talked out of it. She sold 2 of the 6 working helmets to a collector in Rhode Island and kept 4. She put a new roof on the shop and a new floor, and she bought the crane that had sold that foggy morning back from the man who bought it, at a loss to herself, and she says it was worth every penny of the loss to have it back on the pier where it belongs. The bell she would not sell at any price. It sits on a concrete pad outside the Harbor Museum at the top of the town landing. Cleaned but not polished, with the 14 bolt holes left open and unfilled because Vandeleur said the holes are part of the record. Children put their ears against it on hot days because it is cool. And on foggy mornings, when the crane at the end of the pier looks like a pencil sketch somebody started and gave up on, you can stand next to 2 tons of bronze that a whole town laughed at for $140, and read a small plate that gives the appraised value and the name of the man who sealed it, and understand that the quietest person in the room is very often the one who has done the arithmetic.